Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Richardson's Rubicon. I've got with me today Christian Hurst, who is the author of the Lily Starling series of books. And we've managed to meet after arranging through the Christmas and holiday season shenanigans. So finally you're here. Hello, Christian. How are you doing?
Hi, it's good to be here. I'm happy to be here.
You've got your book nicely placed in the back of your camera shot there, I notice. Strategic.
These things just fall into place.
Yeah, they do, don't they? So my stuff there, actually, I know no one's asked, but I thought I'd just say, right, that is my biological dad's paintings. Now, I never met my biological dad. I was sort of adopted by my stepdad, if you like, before I'd even met him. And I didn't even know he existed till I was 30. So for those paintings, that's what they mean to me anyway. And the other bits and bobs are just Starship Enterprises and things like that. And unfortunately, the NX-01 has seen better days because the dog tail got it. So anyway. So that's all that sort of shenanigans going on there. So anyway, tell us a bit about you.
Right, because that was... The Beagle was on that ship, right?
It was, yeah. But I've got a Bernese Mountain Dog, which is about 4 times the size of a Beagle. So that's... Right, so tell us a bit about your book then, Christian. And then we'll go into...
Sure, absolutely. So Lily Starling is a series. It's going to be 5 books, but the very first one is Lily Starling and the Voyage of the Salamander. And it's a new take on classic pulp space opera. It's a young adult series, sort of coming of age, but we enter the story at the same place as the protagonist. And what I mean by that is the reader comes in not knowing anything about this world, but also the protagonist has lost her memory at the beginning of the story. And so it's kind of this interesting perspective where you learn everything from her view because you're in the same spot. So it starts in modern times, 2010 on Earth, and then eventually ends up in the future for this sort of kind of interesting space adventure.
Right, that's interesting. So, I mean, we've seen the waking up with amnesia being done quite a bit in science fiction. And it's always been my view that it's quite good to do that because you do get the audience to follow along with the discovery of the whole world building process. So is that why you chose that, or was it not because of that? It's because you wanted to start off with the amnesia?
It was 100%. Yeah, that was the reason I did it. And because I think I'm inspired a lot by things like Star Trek or even older pulp novels and things like that, and serials. And I think that I wanted people to have certain expectations the way that Lily does in the story, because she's seen like sci-fi movies too. And so when she goes to the future, she kind of expects it to be a certain way. And then you find out not everything is exactly how it seems. And so I think it was a way that I wanted to try to get people hooked on the story and then also subvert their expectations to some extent.
Oh, subvert their expectations. That sounds ominous.
But that is kind of part of my writing is how I tend to do a few rug pulls. I try not to be dishonest to my audience, but I do like to maybe treat them to a little surprise.
Keep the interest there, isn't it? That's what you're doing, yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about the plot?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it is a coming of age story sort of layered on top of the space opera. And so she is discovering who she is and her sense of identity. And the main theme and why I wrote this for young people really is that when I was younger, I often felt like I was kind of an outsider, and I would look at the world kind of from the outside in. And I think being true to yourself in that way, where you know who you are inside, but it can be very lonely at times. And so I wanted to write this book for young people to give that perspective of loneliness and seeking connection, and how, like, if you are true to yourself, that connection will come eventually. And that when that connection, and so that's Lily's journey. She, finds family, and she finds a place in the universe, and she has growth. And by the end of the first book, she's sort of starting to breach adulthood. And then in the second book, it's very much this journey of
starting to grow into herself, basically. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting perspective, the loneliness aspect. And has that got a personal resonance with yourself?
Absolutely, yeah. So I've always been a little weird, and and I've been proud of that. It's like I see the world a little differently, and so things like stories, like sci-fi, like Star Trek, like they meant a lot to me when I was young, and so I grew up in a very religious family. It was a Mormon household, and I don't have any negative feelings about that, but it just not ever quite feeling like I fit in with that, and with many other things, really, gave me this sort of sense of looking at the world like an outsider. And so from a more analytical perspective, and what I observed was that there were a lot of people, for example, in the Mormon church or just around me in that sort of environment, who would get up in church and say things like, I know this is true, or I know this is what's going to happen. And eventually, if something caused them to doubt, or like something they expected didn't happen, it wasn't just like, oh, that's awful, I'll move on with my day. It really, knocked the wind out of them. It kind of was, and they kept I saw people setting themselves up for that over and over again, where it's like, I know this and I know that. And in my mind, I just kept thinking, well, you don't know, though. You don't really know. You want to know. You've got faith, but you don't know. You have faith, right? But you want the comfort of saying that but I think for me, that comfort comes when I admit that I don't know. And so that is something that has been with me my whole life, is just kind of like taking things apart and like questioning them and building them back together for a way that makes sense to me.
Yeah. So briefly then, I don't want to turn this into a personal biography of yourself, but basically the whole sense of fear, I get the impression that when you say that you're looking from the outside in, which has formed the basis of your growth itself and also some of this book, is because maybe you felt that the type of religion you were following was not your choice, and it was kind of like expected of you, and all of the related behaviors for that. Would that be a sensible?
Exactly. And you're right on the money. So the idea being that when someone walks in the room, they have a certain set of expectations about you, right? And those expectations are put on us from the time we're born, like who other people think that we are and see us as and hope that we will be. And it's not always malicious. It's just the way that other people relate to us. And so I think if you are hanging your sense of self on what other people think of you, then that's when those moments come when you can really get tripped up in life and have a crisis of faith, as they call it. And for me, having that strong sense of self has always been something that's helped me get through those times, because when other people say to me, I know who you are, I'm like, okay, but deep down, I'm like, I know who I am. And that's really helped me throughout my life.
Brilliant. So what, we are going to talk about this. So what brought you into humanism?
Yeah, it's just that. It's a contrast between, and if you go back to storytelling and talk about literature and sci-fi and things like that, I think they gave me a lens and a mirror to examine myself with. So, short of sitting down with myself and having those conversations and fleshing out my thoughts, fiction gives us worlds to explore in our minds, and where you can envision yourself in these different circumstances. And so for me, it was the writers, like when I got a little older and I got into, and I love the classics too. So like Victor Hugo, but also Ursula Le Guin, who I found out is actually a Victor Hugo fan, or was a huge Victor Hugo admirer. And so, I became my favorite authors separately. And then I found out there was that connection there. But they often talk about absolutism and the dangers of absolutism. And for me, it was that contrast between absolutism, getting up and saying, I know this and I know that, and just human first, compassion first, a way of living your life. So where if I see that person, I can see them for their differences and all the things that bubble up to the top that I might hate about them, or I could see them as a person first. And then we certainly will disagree on many things, but at least I can give you that baseline of you're a human and we probably have more in common than I'd like to admit, and often more in common than we have different. And that's what humanism means to me. It's just seeing people as people before we start picking them apart as enemies.
Yeah. Very good.
I encourage people. I'm not saying don't join a church. I know plenty of people who have joined churches who are good people. I would encourage people, even if they do belong to any sort of organization, or I would just encourage them to interview themselves now and then, to have those conversations and to say, hey,
that's interesting.
What is it about this that appeals to me and my sense of self, and to make sure that you are really talking to you and not what everybody else thinks you are.
Very good. Excellent. So, a bit of a subject change now, going back to the book, really. So there's a few topics that we were talking about earlier on through messages. And one is that you said how to build sci-fi worlds that feel lived in rather than over-explained. So do you want to give us a few examples of that and maybe
Sure.
talk about
that? Part of it is I think a lot of times when people ask me to explain my process and they talk about things like they're very much siloed, like world building and, character and plot, and like they're all independent of each other,
I know.
And for me, I start with two very important things. Like, to me, the most important things that I start with are character and theme. And then from that, because it's like, who am I talking about? And what are the sort of major things that I want to explore in this work? And that's just how I create art.
Who and why, general. Basically. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, I could tell a story that fits into any context. I often say about space opera, it's like this could take place at the bottom of the ocean. It doesn't have to be on a spaceship. These are human stories, And so I want to, if I'm writing something that I want to be meaningful, it has to be about something and not just like a series of events. And so those are the things I start with. And then as far as the world building goes, yes, I want it to feel very real. I want it to feel very rich and textured, but I don't think the audience in general, that every reader is different, but wants to know, like, right off the bat how the computer works, or, what kinds of drinks they have in the cabinet necessarily, or like all the little details of it, And I think if you want to write that as a artist or as a writer in as background and like understand it so that the world is consistent, I think that's good. And then later it can go up on the wiki or whatever. But like a lot of times we hit people, and I've done this in the past when I was younger and used to write short stories, and I used to write video games and comics and things. I would hit people with too much, I think, right away.
Too much all at once.
Because it's fun. Like as a Star Trek fan, for example, I would love when you did get to see a little bit, they would like give you a little something, and it's like, that's how.
That's right. They would draw the curtain slightly,
right? Just a little tiny bit, but that's what makes it fun, is when it's a little bit, and you don't want a whole episode explaining how the holodeck works,
Yeah, although we did get that.
Yeah, right. I'm sure we've
several times. Yeah, it is interesting. So it's more of an organic approach you're taking, really, isn't it? You're sort of building it as building it as you go. Sounds as if it's unplanned. So I'm not saying that, but you're giving detail as it's required.
Yes,
What I would
exactly.
say.
And building it as I go is actually not inaccurate, because once I have the outline done, and I'll outline all the chapters and the general sense of where everybody is in it, so that basically I can fit the whole book onto a few pages, right?
Yeah.
Describing what the story is going to be. And once I have that, I sit down and I write from chapter 1 to the end. And that's my process. I know that doesn't work for everybody, but I like to write myself into problems and then write myself out of problems, which is kind of like the supposedly the way Shakespeare worked. I don't know if that's true, because it's all, everything around Shakespeare is all like speculation. But
including
I like
Shakespeare.
Exactly, the man himself. But I like to do that because in life there's no going back and fixing stuff, so it kind of feels more organic that way to me. It's just like I'll write a whole chapter and then I'll go back and I'll clean it up, and then I won't look at it again until I get done with the other chapters. In general, I break the rules sometimes, but like that's my general process.
Yeah, well, sounds like a good process. It's sounds as if it makes sense. So we were also talking about the darkness of sci-fi as well as the lightness of sci-fi. And I know it sounds as if we had an offline conversation, but I promise any listener it was like literally 20 seconds, wasn't it, or something? So do you want to talk about that, your whole idea about the darkness and the lightness and that theme, I guess, over the sci-fi?
Well, I think that sometimes these shows and books and whatever it is, these stories can be a little bit not approachable sometimes, I think, depending on the consumer, whoever is approaching it. But I think that, like, I see all these sci-fi shows on Apple TV, and once I get into them, they're really good, but they're so heavy and dark, and like, just even from the trailers, it's like, I know that I'm in for just like a really heavy ride, and I'm not sure what sort of mood I need to be in to watch the show, It's the same way with books. I've read, I've read a few dozen books this year, and some of the sci-fi has been, it's almost like a binary. It has to be either really heavy or just really super duper campy. And I kind of wanted something in between. Like, I think the old Star Trek was always that for me, where it was like, there were heavy themes, but it also had some silly, and it had some campiness, and it had some fun, right? So I wanted to incorporate some of that, like and I did that because life is fun, life is silly, but it's also very heavy. And so, like, nothing is just straightforward binary. And like, also in some of those like TV shows, it's like, turn a light on for the love of God. Like, it's
how can you see what you're doing?
But like, so I just wanted it to feel more like our world, where like sometimes things are just utterly ridiculous, and like, I don't know, you have to laugh to get through the day.
Your books have been compared, someone's compared your books to the Firefly series, which, when you were talking about seriousness and campiness, Firefly literally was that, wasn't it? It was
exactly.
Wild West in space, even more than Star Trek was meant to be,
Right, totally.
Yeah. So
and so I think I have these heavy themes sometimes, like that, real emotions, because I want them to feel real. But at the same time, there's always a little bit of fun,
light relief. Yeah. Good.
If you're talking about that light versus dark,
yeah,
the one thing that we didn't mention was hope. And I think
I was just looking at that on there, and I was thinking how to bring that in.
And in our current like world, I know that people are stressed out. And that's the way the world always is. I mean, every generation has its huge stressor in like existential dread.
I don't know, Christian. I'm several years older than you are. I have never known a period like this.
Okay. Well, there you go.
This is just awful. Absolutely
it is so
awful.
Right. So there's a lot to worry about.
And I'm comparing that with the Cold War.
Yeah.
you know, it's just terrible right now. So
right. And so I think part of what this emotional realism that I try to bake in is that, like, even in very dark times, that there can be a thread of hope. And so the first book was very much like finding yourself and discovering, connection. The second book is very much like working at, like, growing up, and also like trusting in your own energy, and just sort of like Lily learning to own the room and just sort of make her own decisions. But the third book is, which I'm writing right now, is a lot heavier. It's a lot darker. And so I'm working on that vein of hope throughout these very, very hopeless situations. And so I'm hoping that will be a good progression for the reader, that, like, you get to know the characters, and then you get to know some more mature themes. And then by the third book, you're ready for a little bit of depth, and you're still rooting for Lily to have hope through that, even though it's not easy.
Dum dum dum. Sounds really fascinating. So I haven't read your books yet, but I've got it on my list now, by the way. So I'll probably revisit and drag you back at some point as well.
There you go.
So we could talk a little bit more in depth. But before I do buy these books, the universe in which Lily is in, right? Is it related to our own universe? Is she in a completely different place? I mean, where is she? And what time is this?
So this is in the 29th century, and it's far future, eventually, after she goes to the future. Mm-hmm. And that's where the books take place after that. And it is a version of our future. It's like, I tried to be realistic to a point, although I do use the space opera convenience of, like, very humanoid aliens, which obviously,
excellent.
That
keeps everything comfortable, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So there's some of that, and there's some slight elements of fantasy, nothing more than like Star Trek would have, where, like, I don't have like transporters where you can beam places, but I do have some like psionic abilities and stuff like that.
Right. Okay. So you've relied on a genetic improvement rather than a technological improvement.
Right.
In a way.
Exactly.
Yeah. Quantum technologies, do they feature at all?
I haven't gotten that technical yet.
Okay. Just thought I'd ask. So cool. So so you talk about the role of belief systems, mythology, and symbolism in world building. Can you tell me a bit more about that at all, please, Christian?
Absolutely. I think, growing up in a religious family, it was very important to all the people that I knew, really, in my circle as a kid. And then when I even did some missionary work for the church before I went my own way. And I met a lot of people from other faiths and learned a lot about different comparative religions. And so I've always been fascinated about that. I've probably read more religious texts than a lot of religious people have.
Wow.
but I think that it's an interesting part of the texture of things. I wrote a short story in between the first and the second book that is called Tea with Roz, and it's a little love story between two characters that takes place between the two books. And the reason I wrote it is because it really sets the stakes for part of the story in the second book. And it's free. It's available online for anybody to go read. It's a good gateway into the universe. But in that story, I do quite a bit of like ritual and that's included in that story, and some in the first book, but mostly in the short story and in the second book. But I think that it just gives, because that is such a central part of people's lives, and just the framework in which they view everything. It's a lens through which they see.
It's through how they operate, how they view the world, everything, right. Isn't it? Yeah.
And so it has to be in there, even if it's not central to the story. It has to be, like, this character is informed by that belief or that ritual or whatever it is, and you'll see there's a close relationship between two characters, one Lily, and then Zen, who she meets in the first book. And Zen comes from a very different cultural environment than humans, and so that I think will continue to play a big part in the character dynamics between them.
Sounds like there's plenty to compare and contrast between the two there.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And it goes down even to the little details, like you talk about faith, right? You talk about Lily is a little more like me, where she tends to pick everything apart, and it's like she doesn't accept anything necessarily at face value. It's just has to dissect it and find out all the little bits. And Zen is very much the other way, where it's like, well, it could be this way or this way, and very decisive and very clean and ordered, and so it's a fun contrast to play with. Yeah. And I think very much mirrors real life. A lot of opposites attract.
Yeah, that is quite true, actually. Yes. So good. Right. So how long did it take you to write that first book then?
Well,
the first book.
Technically, I've been working on it.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you before you even begin. Have you got all 5 worked out in your head right now? Or have you just got the first 2 or 3 worked out in your head?
I have the arc worked out.
Right. Okay.
And then the first 3 in more detail than 4 and 5. But I have a good idea of what's in there. I just haven't plotted it out, so to speak.
Yeah.
But yes, so as far as time, I've been thinking about these since I was 19, and I'm 42 now. So it's been quite a process, but
quite a journey.
Quite a journey. Exactly. And I put a lot down on the page back when I was younger, and then had not picked it up for a long time. So it wasn't exactly 20 years of work, but I've been noodling on it, and then finally when I sat down to write it, it comes out a lot faster than I first expected, actually, because it's almost like I have to get this on the page because it's ready to come out. And so I've been sort of churning through it. I wrote the first and the second one at the same time. Like I went right into the second one from writing the first one. So.
Yeah. So would you say that this story is in any way reflective of anything you've been doing yourself?
Yes. I think that
like a journey,
Yeah, I think a lot of it does harken back to that that early period in my adult life when I was sort of finding my way. But I also think now in hindsight, like I have a lot of clarity around like identity and choice and this whole contrast between absolutism that I mentioned and agency. But I think also more recently, we all went through the COVID-19 pandemic and things like that, and sort of reframed the way that I don't know about most people, but I had sort of a double reframing. So like during the pandemic, I thought about the world one way, and then sort of taking a couple years to recover from that, like lockdown, I almost gained a completely new perspective on the way that I thought about things. That sounds vague, but it's like
it is vague.
I was very isolated, and I was seeing the world through that lens of like, oh, maybe things are a lot simpler, because you're like only surrounded by your family, And then it took a couple of years after that to sort of want to accept again that we live in a huge connected world, that, that we have to coexist as human beings. We can't just be stuck in our houses all the time. And so it was a hard transition for me after that, like, general acceptance of being isolated, to transition back out to being, connected with people. And so that was very much, for me, a journey that connected to this story that I had already sort of been thinking about. And so I think it was a natural fit of, like, I almost had to go through that again, where I realized that connection with other people is possible, which is important to somebody like me who's like an extrovert, but I almost learned to be introverted during the pandemic and just sort of hide from everybody.
Yeah, I think we all did that, didn't we? So there's a lot of us did that anyway. So, I mean, we chose our time to move from the Midlands, and we moved to Scotland, and then COVID hit. And of course, we were in a new place, starting up a new business with nobody we knew, and then everyone went into lockdown.
Right.
So that was a big thing for us at the time. You just had to cope, didn't you?
Right.
So,
right. And sometimes you do just have to survive. I think that's, part of life. And that was
part of life.
That was a very extreme example, but it happened. Yeah. It's such a universal. I think those themes are still sort of on everybody's mind.
Yeah. So the Lily Starling emerging from the time period that she was in into a new time period would be, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Analogous to that, really, I suppose.
And then rediscovering and sort of finding yourself. And then in the second book, I really explored a lot of themes around frustration and like Lily. That's part of like coming of age, I think, in general. But I was also feeling it at the time, and it's like where frustration tends to sort of pile on. It's like you're frustrated about one thing, and you're trying to work it out, and then just another thing hits, and another thing, and that was how that story arc. It was like her frustration built for the first act of the book until like finally there was some release for the reader as well. So it's like I didn't want to stress people out too much, but it was like that you could feel the piling on and the piling on, and then so I think that's what made that story work. And then the third book is going to be a little more about that sort of the institutional models that we have to work with or against that are sort of out of our control. Like there are, things that control the world that we can't necessarily
affect.
Right. Like personally, but that we have to sort of work within those systems. So,
yeah. Okay. Do you want to go into more detail on that?
Sure. I think that's one thing that Lily gets from me is very much this being suspicious about the authority and, having to sort of dissect the purpose of things and like, why is something the way it is? Does this law make sense? Does this, is this ethical? And that kind of thing, because you're looking at it from a lens of your personal morality rather than just accepting a list of rules that you've been given, And so I think it could be frustrating to see the world that way, because it, at least in my imagination, if you are someone who easily accepts like a set of commandments that are just handed to you, it must be comforting in some ways, right? But like for me, that I've never been able to just sort of blindly be like, okay, that makes sense.
Sounds interesting. I mean, basically, I've interviewed a lot of people. I don't know if you know about the Bobbyverse and at all. Do you know about the Bobbyverse at all? No?
No.
Dennis E. Taylor, I think, is the author there.
Okay.
But I've interviewed several people, and a lot of people, not just naming him due to the fact that for any particular reason, but some people compartmentalize and talk about structures and processes and methodologies to write books. And that's where I was originally coming from with you. But you're talking about empathy and connections and not stressing the audience out and all of that sort of stuff, which doesn't sound like the other authors that I've spoken to who are all about the technical details of writing a book. Why is that, Christian?
I think it's probably because I don't have a background in literature. So I have a background in art and in communication. And so, my career is in advertising and marketing and brand marketing.
Right.
But my passion has always been in connecting with people through art. And so whether that's acting or filmmaking or video game design or comics or whatever it is, whatever project it is I'm working on, the connection is what's most important to me. And I always tell people with my work, even when I used to do a lot of drawing and painting, I would say, people would say, what does this mean? Because I tend to have a very expressive style. And I would say, not to be annoying, but how do you feel when you look at it? And that's part of what it means, because art is not in a vacuum. Art is experienced by those who enjoy it and connect with it. And so I can stress myself out by making a technically perfect novel, and then nobody likes it. Or I can, think more about putting in, and the thing is, I don't write for any specific audience, but I just write from the heart, and then I find the audience. And it is kind of hard sometimes because I don't write to tropes. I can't advertise and say, if you like this book, you'll love my book, because it's not exactly like another book, but once I find the audience, I tend to get very good compliments that are like, oh, your characters, especially if the characters felt so real, or the emotional theme, things like that. And so I admit I'm not a very structured
it's taken us a while to get to this point in the conversation, but I think you're absolutely right. Judging by the reviews I've read and the commentary, specifically around the kind of not the humor, but the reality.
Mm-hmm.
The reality. So I would say that our earlier point about having a little bit of humor, having a bit of seriousness, having the conflict, not having it too dark, not having it too light, all of those bits, those really shine through. And the way that you have answered questions and everything that you've said all talks to me about the personal aspect. None of it talks to me, as I've already mentioned, about the technicalities and all of that sort of stuff. And I think that would obviously be better for people to consume. That's what I'm trying to say. I think that'll be a much more enjoyable read than, someone who's gone, I don't know, full-on world-building, top-down approach, where everything has all been sliced, diced, and cubed and sorted out beforehand. And, I just think that...
I don't think my books
I don't want to say off the cuff. I don't want to say off the cuff. I just want to say, would you say it's a little bit more fluid? Because the way you described how you did it was get the arc, get the sections of the book separated out, so I know roughly which book's going to do what. Have an idea what's going to happen in that book, and then just sit and write. That's what you said you'd do, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it comes together almost cinematically. And I did, to be honest, I did, film school. I did. So I think that way. It's not. I don't. And I don't begrudge anybody. I love a good structured novel. Obviously, I mentioned Victor Hugo earlier, and that kind of thing. Brandon Sanderson, I'm always in awe of his work and his world building and that kind of thing. But it is different than my process. So
yeah. So I'm coming to learn that the process that people have, which is obviously very personal to them, affects their world building to a greater extent than perhaps they realize to a large.
Absolutely. I think so.
So I think that's really interesting because I don't know, you don't want to read anything I've written because that's just going to be so haphazard. You'll be like, what is this guy on? So yeah, good. Right. So have you got anything else you would like to add, Christian?
Just that I think that we need more art in the world, and I think we need more people expressing themselves, and I think it's healthy, and I think it's good, and I think if anybody out there feels like they need permission to create, or like there's some sort of gatekeeper standing in the way, I would just encourage them to create, and to create more and more and more, and that's eventually how your work will reach an audience. When I started out in my career, like all designers or artists or whatever, there's a certain amount of anxiety about putting your art out into the world, or your work. And, obviously I got over that because I had to, because it was my profession. And so you put stuff out there, people see it and respond to it, and then they forget about it the next day. And that's fine, because it's time for me to put out the next thing. And that's one thing that I'm very grateful to my career for teaching me, is that it's okay if it doesn't work out. Don't be precious about that piece of work. Put the next, focus your attention into the next one and make that work. And so when something like Lily Starling resonates with an audience, it is so meaningful to somebody like me who has put a great deal of work out into the world that people have forgotten about. And so it's kind of neat when an audience connects with it, and when it becomes, a bestseller and that kind of thing. So it's nice.
Wow. Bestseller. Excellent. Thank you, Christian. Thanks very much for taking the time to come on the show, and thanks for answering my inane questions.
No, it's been wonderful. I really appreciate it.